Hello and welcome to the first of many intro videos to JavaScript. My goal is to post a few of these. This is just going to be introductory, and I'll post a few as we get further into different libraries that you could use within JavaScript. So using things like right now we'll be going through just intro JavaScript and intro D3, but I'm probably going to post a couple more, D3 videos and a few videos going through the different web services that make visualizations on the web easier to deal with. But we'll start out with just looking at JavaScript and having an introduction to it. So when we were last doing interactive visualizations, we were doing it in Shiny, and I made a point to talk about how you could kind of divide this into a web app into two sides, the client side and the server side. A lot of that is abstracted with Shiny, so you don't really have to think about the structure all the time, but this becomes way more apparent in something like JavaScript, which is a general purpose web language. So you'll have to be thinking a lot more about your client side and server side. So to review of what client side and server side means is if you have an app like this, I am using these drop downs to make changes to the data here, and I'm adding traces. So you could see that I'm making these drop-down changes, and it's going. The app is essentially going to the server. It's retrieving new information and bringing that back to the client side. So you could think of the server as being where it's retrieving this information. There are ways of doing something like this without having to deal with a server side. So in other words, that would be just having a client side to your JavaScript app. So something like this is done through Plotly, and it's getting the roughly the same sort of interaction that we saw before, but this actually isn't doing anything on the server side. Everything is happening on the client side. And I won't spend too much time on this. I plan on getting into Plotly a bit later. But technically what's happening, and the reason why this is allowed to be fully on the server side, is all of the traces are built at once. And these drop-downs, while a user may experience them as filtering the data, what's really happening is we're making the data either visible or not visible. So you could see that's essentially what's happening here. We're deciding which of the four traces are going to be visible or not visible. So that's just quickly, hopefully a way that makes it easy to think about server side versus client side. So when you're working with JavaScript, JavaScript is able to be called in HTML pages. So I'll post all these examples after I post this video. So this is kind of a quick intro page that shows you the different ways that you could use JavaScript within HTML. And the first thing to note is how to get these things to run. If you just open them up in your browser, that's not enough. You need to essentially run your own server. So remember before we were talking about server side versus client side, you have to manually set up the server yourself. That being said, it's a trivial process to get the server set up. You pretty much, if you have, and you guys do have Python, you'll be able to have a quick, simple HTTP server. So this part will involve a lot of terminal work, and I'll just go into my terminal here. Now, just a few things to note about how you sort of surf through the terminal, as it were. You will have to run the simple server through your terminal, and it matters where you run the server. So essentially, you're going back and forth between your different folders. And this is the same on a Mac or on Windows. It's CD, whichever folder you want to go to. So CD CUNY, that'll bring me to the CUNY folder. LS, this will be dir in Windows. That will show you what's in that folder. And you're able to sort of surf around like that. And if you want to go up a level, just do something like that, cd ... So, and the reason why I think it's important to at least think about becoming more comfortable with the terminal is this will help you out with future courses and future work as you apply the skills that you're learning here. So this is, and plus this is really, this will really help in understanding how to think about JavaScript in this way. So we're going to go into where we have everything saved. So I have a Lecture 5 folder saved. And I could go into JavaScript examples, but I actually have two examples here. So when I do ls, you can see I have my hello world and hello D3. So I actually want to stay outside of both of those. And the reason why, I'll get to in a bit, but just you just sort of know that like you could start your local server however many levels up within a folder hierarchy, but you wouldn't be able to start it further down. It needs to be able to sort of encompass the environment that you're working with. And I'll get into in a bit a couple of what that means in practice. So I'm in my Lecture 5 folder, and all I'm going to do is copy and paste this command here. So in the notes, you could see that this is a very short intro, and this is how you would start it in the terminal. So when I run this, I could just copy and paste that, and you'll see that it's serving at a particular port. So we'll have to take note of that. In this case, it's port 8000. And it looks like it's kind of hung up there. And that's a good thing, because that means that the server is running, and we're going to be able to use it to look at to essentially run our JavaScript. So now that you have the page running, I'm going to go to and I'm using Chrome, and I highly recommend that no matter what you're using, Windows or Mac, you use Chrome, because Chrome has great developer tools for web development. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go into localhost :8000. You can see here, you could also do it by going to your IP address, but localhost is just easy, in my opinion, to remember. So I'm going to go here, and because I'm not entering in any additional information, so any additional structure, like you could see, these are some past projects I've been working on. When I do this, I'm going to end up with a directory listing. And now I'm able to explore anything that is in my examples. So if I click this, you could see I have now hello D3 or hello world, and I'm going to go into hello world, and you could see the pages and folders that I have here. So I have a JavaScript script, that's .js. I have an HTML page, so that's JS in web page, and then I have, this will be referenced later, the data folder. So if I click on the page, this shows me essentially what I've made, and you can see this is just doing some pretty interesting interesting things that it's using JavaScript to calculate. So things like this, getting an input field, writing some sort of conditional output like this, you need some, you essentially need some JavaScript on the back end that's telling you, what do I do with this input? How am I controlling what I'm putting in my output? So that's what this page looks like. And to look at the code, you could see the examples here. So you have your standard HTML. So and I won't get too much into the kind of different HTML tags, but if you go to w3schools.com, there's a lot of awesome content here about learning HTML. So this is a nice sort of on-the-fly resource that you could use. I don't think it's necessary to go through sort of a full tutorial or anything, but this is great to kind of keep open as you're playing around with these assignments going forward. So we have your standard HTML like this. And one option for writing script is to include it right in your HTML page. So similarly to here where we have our head, we have our body, and those are the two main portions of an HTML document. And we also have script as a tag type. So here we have this, which is opening it, and this right here, which is closing it. So you have that sort of H1, end H1. Here we have script. We have some options. So whenever you have options, if you're adding them, you use a single space and you enter in the further sort of options there. So you have your option, but what matters is this is a script tag, and what matters is this is ending the script tag. And between the two script tags, we're free to write in JavaScript. So this is just some hello world examples of how you would be able to place these elements. So you're essentially inserting the HTML directly in quotes. I guess I'll sort of mention this now that it's so these here you have this document. Document refers to the full HTML page, and I guess that's sort of the most I'll get into right now. If I find that there's need, I'll go into it further because I think it might be a bit confusing since this isn't a web development class. But just sort of keep in mind, document means the HTML page as a rule of thumb. So we're essentially writing these elements. So we're writing, P, which is just new paragraph, B, which is bold, and we're writing new elements here. So, and then ending that script. So when we're writing these, you could see these showing up, and then if you right click or double click on Mac, you could go to Inspect in Chrome, and you'll see that you get access to the dev tools. And there's a lot here, but really the two main tabs that you're going to be interested in are Elements and Console. Sometimes you might use Sources if you're working with things in that way, but we'll just mainly focus on Elements and Console. So Elements is, and you could kind of see clearly here, this is basically a repeat of the HTML that we have that we've written out here, but it also includes what we've entered with JavaScript. So in terms of debugging, this is really good for trying to make sure that your JavaScript code did the right thing. So over here, we did this document write, we had a PEB, and then while working in JavaScript, etc. And you could see here that we have that element right here. And if you were debugging a page like this and you were wondering, why nothing was showing up, why something seems to be broken, you would go into inspect and look at the particular elements that you're that concern you. So if you didn't mean to put a B here, you meant to put italics, which is an I, as an example, then you would be able to see pretty quickly that you ended up with a B here. Something in your JavaScript code must be causing that. So you kind of get a clue of where to look when you're debugging. So that's really the main the benefit of having this Elements tab. And your console is a JavaScript console. So similarly to R, where you have your scripts and you have your console down here where you could just type in one-off commands, you could do one-off commands within your console here. So if I say console log, which is the JavaScript equivalent of print, if I just say something like that, and you'll see your hello world come up here. So, and this is also very important. I'll be utilizing the console when we're looking at D3 and how to find out what kind of data you're bringing in and what kind of data you have, and inspecting various variables that you may have. So that's a overview of the dev tools in your browser. And so most of this I'll leave to you guys to look through. So as I mentioned, you have your scripts that are bringing in that you could write directly within the HTML. You also have the down here, you'll also, so here you could see you could define functions and use those functions later on. You could also reference other JavaScript sources. So here, rather than having the code written in HTML, I have a separate JavaScript file that this is referencing, and this is very useful because it sort of lets you keep your pages separate. And by the way, one thing to mention, I'm using Atom, which is my preferred text editor. There are a lot of text editors out there. There's Sublime Text. I would recommend for doing these sorts of projects that you think about getting a text editor like that. It lets you pick, and Sublime Text does this also. It lets you pick what language you're looking at. It colors based on that language, so it leads to a pretty nice user experience. So as you're doing these sorts of projects, I would recommend having something like this handy. So here I have a separate JavaScript page. And this is useful. Like right now, it's just one function that I've written, but you could imagine that you could have a full JavaScript code base that you've written. If you're bringing in external packages, this is how you would be able to bring in external packages. So you're referencing someone else's commands, functions that they may have abstracted for you. D3 is brought in this way. So that's just one thing to note, that you can bring in external sources. And what we're doing here is we're bringing in that source, and then we're accessing the function that we brought in. So here, this myScript function is just simply returning. You could also import other scripts. And what this is saying is it's just going to simply add that that document write my script. One other thing to note, this I'll let you guys look more at this, but one thing I just want to make sure that you guys kind of look at and digest on your own is this right here. This is a common sort of framework that's used by JavaScript developers, is having an empty tag. So usually, a lot of times it's a div, simply because that's kind of an all-purpose, I just want to place something here. And we're using this document again. We're get element by ID, and we're printing target. So if we wanted to, we could test what that gives us in the console here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to see what this returns, and you could see that it's returning that div. So what? So in broader terms, what this is doing is basically taking that. So it's get element by ID. The ID is target. That's what this is here. It's getting that element and it's adding something to it. So that's kind of a common way of thinking. This, I think, is a pretty kind of illustrating example of JavaScript. So, but I'll let you guys digest the rest of this on your own, and after this, we'll go into actually looking at D3. So I recommended this book, Interactive Data Visualization for the web. And we'll go through an example. Like what I particularly recommend for D3 is, I believe we're on chapter 5 now. Yeah, chapter 5, data. So this is what I would recommend for getting used to getting used to D3. So we'll just copy and paste this, and we're going to create a new index.html. And I'm going to just format this a bit so that it's easier to read. So we're bringing in a couple of things here. So we have HTML, head. I'll just do that. Another thing that's good about text editors like this is they let you do really cool formatting like this, which helps when you're working with this sort of code. So this is going to be our main template of a D3 page. So it's very it's very bare bones. We just have our head. We're bringing in D3, and I'm actually one thing that I recommend doing is most JavaScript libraries that are like third-party JavaScript libraries that you'll be bringing in. So things like D3, things like Plotly, things like NVD3 is another sort of wrapper around D3. They'll have what are called CDNs, and this allows you to always get the most recent version of that JavaScript library. So you could do something like this. I'm just going to Google for D3 CDN, and we have a link right here. So the purpose of these CDNs is if you are using these in a professional manner, you want to always receive the recent updates. So this allows you to do that. So here I'm just grabbing that, and I'll replace this file path with what we're looking at here. And then I'm going to be editing with this example.js. So now let's go see what we have with this index.html. HTML. So if I go back, and I'm going to get out of my DevTools, I'll go back again, and I'll go to hello D3. Now, one thing about pages named index.html is they'll automatically assume that if you go into the folder, so here if I go into hello D3, it will open up index.html. So that's just one thing to note. That's why I don't have an index.html here. And we have nothing showing up here because we've only loaded a template here. And what I'm going to do is rather than use this inline script, I'm going to have my source equals example.js. So I'm going to have this tie to my example here. And so now we're ready to implement a couple of the examples from the book. So, and this I think goes through D3 in a very sort of illuminating kind of way. So, so D3 is kind of built around these what are called chaining methods. So you could kind of see how your form is going to have a lot of these dots, and that's very JavaScript-like, and D3 makes pretty big use of that. So what we're doing here is we're and I'll let you guys read all of this to kind of go through this sort of link by link, and I'll just kind of go through the major points. So when I look at this, we're selecting an element. So we're selecting the element body. We're appending an element, and in this case, we're appending the element P, and we're adding text to that element. So it's kind of nested in each other, and that text is new paragraph. And when that is saved, and when I refresh this, you can see that new paragraph is showing up here. And when I inspect this, it's going to be, it should look pretty similar to what you could have guessed, where you have that P and we have new paragraph. So that's kind of your simple hello world example. And then you could, obviously what D3 really shines at is bringing in data. So what I'll first do is so you could define a data set kind of just within line, and actually I do want to use that. And we'll also have this right here. Now this is going to bring in a local CSV. So if so now this I think is important to look at the format of. So when you're bringing in a CSV, you're using sort of a function as an argument, an anonymous function in this case. And so we could have defined a function and included that as an argument here, but you'll find a lot of times it's easier to just have an anonymous function like this and write what you want to do with your CSV essentially. But the format is you need this .csv to kind of encase everything that you're doing with your CSV. So let's just look at this piece by piece. So there's d3.csv, that's what's bringing in the CSV. Now I want to bring in the data, and I'll use my I'll use this for that. So I want to bring in this presidents.csv, and this is going to be for the beginner homework 5. And we are currently running our local server here. We're going, I could see JS examples, or I'm sorry, we're running it here. I could go to, no, we are running it back at lecture 5. You have hello world and hello D3 and hello D3. And we have data over here. And because we're in another, so the data that we want is over here, but we're currently over here. And the way that we're going to get at that is to go up and for JavaScript, single or double quotes, I believe they don't matter. I always just use single quotes out of habit. So you'll see them mixed up a lot. If this were more professional, I would definitely be careful about my standards there. But so here I'm bringing in ... That's going to bring us up. Hello data, and then data world. So we have a string which has our path. So we're going a level up. We're going to hello world. We're going to data. We're going to presidents. And then the next argument is going to be this anonymous function. So it's function data, and data is going to be the actual CSV data. And a logical kind of first thing that you would want to do with this is just to see what format it's in. So this console log will print it out in the console, so we could inspect it in the browser. So I'm going to define this, and this is like any other function in JavaScript. I like separating it in lines like this. So I'll just console log the data. So hopefully typing it all out gives you a kind of a clearer idea of what's happening here. So this function is actually like this here, this CSV function is actually encasing everything everything here. And we have this function as an argument, and then we have kind of further lines of code nested in it. So there's a lot going on here. And once I do that, I could go to this page and we'll inspect our console now. So you can see I have I have an object here, and it's saying that it's an array. It has length 23, and when I look at this, you could see each of these sub-objects. So it's a really cool way of inspecting the kinds of JavaScript variables that you're looking at. So here I'm looking at you could see I have kind of height, name, weight, and that's pretty much what we wanted, because the CSV that we have this name, height, weight, and then we have the data as expected. So we're bringing in, so the way to access these in JavaScript. So let's say I wanted to console log just Adams's name, and how would I do that within JavaScript? I would here go to my file and note that Adams is the second row. It's we're not counting the title in this case, so we have row 0, row 1, and so in that case, this is going to be number 1. And you access the different elements here. So this height, this name, this weight, you access them with dots. So here I could just say dot name. And when I do that, and I refresh this, I will now see just the name coming up, this J Adams. So this kind of notation, it's what's called JSON. So you essentially have a kind of named list. If you guys took 607, this is pretty much this should be reminding you of MongoDB and how things are stored there. That's a JSON document store, and that's essentially JavaScript object notation. So it comes from JavaScript. That's really where it originated, and that's how you access various elements of it. So you could have arrays of objects. You could have an object. One of these could be an array. Like, not if I were reading CSV, but you could have like, I'm sure you remember from 607 that you could get pretty complicated with the structure of your JSON objects. And here we're going to be accessing that sort of structure. So we had our simple. We'll now get back to working with our non-CSV data. I just wanted to take a quick side note to look at CSV, because you guys will be using that for your for the intermediate homework assignment 5. So let's take a look at the next step in dealing with data sets. So this time we want to do something similar to what we were doing here, but we want to use our data. So right now we're just looking at the body, we're appending P and adding new paragraph. This is all arbitrary. The goal of D3 is to have that tied to a data set. So if I bring this in, and let me comment that out. So now what we're doing is we have this new command here, select all. And if you notice here, first we appended P, and here we're assuming that we're going to be adding those P elements in the future. So right off the bat, we're just saying we want to select all P. Then we're bringing in the data. So in this case, it's just the data set, but in other cases, we may be looping through a CSV. We're going to hit enter, and that's what allows us to essentially create these new elements. So this goes into more detail about what the enter function does. And it's only then that we're appending this P and then adding text to it. So in this case, we're sticking with that new paragraph text. And when we do this, we could now refresh our page. I'm gonna have to restart my local host. Whoop, started in the wrong place. Let's try this one more time, and we'll go into our D3 page. Now we can see what's happening here. So for each element of the data set, it added a P. So if I look at my elements now, I could see that I have 5 of these, and what D3 was doing was for each one of these data points, it's appending a paragraph that says new paragraph. That's great in terms of what getting at some of the mechanics, but that's just slightly less useless than what we had here. We still have something that it's tied to the data in terms of the number of elements, but it's not tied to the data in terms of what the data actually is. So what we'd ideally like to do is see something that is somehow referencing that data. And that's possible by bounding the data to these elements. So here you can see they're sort of going through the same example here as what we're doing. And I recommend reading this because it sort of shows you through looking at the inspect element that the data is actually there. So if I don't know exactly how he did it, but he'll show you how to, yeah, he's just console logging that. So when you, so now the way that you access that data is we're going to change this right here to this. And remember with CSV, we were using anonymous functions. Here we're doing that same thing. So we're essentially using this as an anonymous function, and we're using that this function D. So, or function return D. So let me just copy this, and let's copy that. And now that we have this, and if I refresh the page, now we're getting somewhere. Now we see that the data is showing up. That's the data set that we defined, and that's pretty much the point of D3 is we have a data set and we're displaying information based on that data set. So what's happening here is there's, essentially this text box, it could take in a string. It could also take in this anonymous function whose argument is the data. So here I'm just returning the data, but I could return something like this. So if here we have D, let's say I wanted to just add 5 to each of those points. So I could say return D plus 5. This is any function, so I'm able to kind of work with it in any way that I would like. And now when I refresh this, you could see that it added 5 to each of those numbers. And I'll leave this there. That's really a good introduction and a good place to stop for this portion. I recommend reading the first, not the full first 5 chapters, like basically the material that I went through. So starting in page, I think it was like basically the beginning of chapter 5 until like kind of where I left off. That's really the meat of getting introduced to D3. There's also chapter 3, which is very useful. So if I go back here, the technology fundamentals, that's also a very good intro chapter. And again, I think it would be too much to read all of it. If you have the time, do it. But given that time is a precious resource, feel free to just kind of skim what you need from the technology fundamentals. But the main meat, I would say, begin in chapter. So essentially, read chapter 5 and kind of keep your thumb in chapter 3 for when you need to refer to it. And so that's kind of the best content I could think of there. I'll post homework 1, and this should be, or homework 5, and it'll include 2 options: doing a beginner and intermediate homework. So I'll post both of these, and this will sort of go through what you could do with this, and then that will be the assignment due next Sunday. And after that, the 6th assignment is going to be a visualization based on your final project. So spend the next 2 weeks thinking about JavaScript. I would definitely recommend trying to get your final project in JavaScript. But if you're not able to, it's more important to get that final project going rather than remaining stalled and trying to make a pretty tough new technology to work for you. So feel free to take other options. And I'm hoping either next week or next week we have our meetup, so we could talk more about the homeworks then. And I'll go into some other topics here. Thanks a lot.